I'm Trish Gray. I'm the Senior Development Manager from O'Reilly School of Technology. And today I'm really excited to have with me Perl expert Peter Scott. Peter is the author of our 4-course series in Perl programming, and he's also author of the books Perl Medic and Perl Debugged, and of the video DVD Perl Fundamentals. And if you've ever been to OSCON, I'm sure you've seen him there. He's done lots of presentations there. He's taught all over North America, and he's even taught on the Perl Whirl cruise, if you remember far back enough for that. Right now he lives in Vancouver Island with Grace and his daughter Ilana, who is adorable. They're here right now too. And he's going to talk today about how to deal with legacy Perl code. And if any of you have programmed in Perl or in any language, I'm a PHP programmer, then you know how difficult that can be. So without further ado, I'm going to give it over to Peter.
Thanks, Trish, for that great introduction. And I'm really excited to be here down for our meetings, and also to be working on the 4th course now in the O'Reilly Perl Certificate Series.
Oh, we're so excited to have it come out. Oh, yeah.
Those first 3 courses were a lot of work, and this one's going to be even more work, but I really enjoy the final product.
Good.
And so what I'm going to be talking about today is something that's really different from those courses, but something that's very important and pressing to a lot of people, because Perl has been out now for quite a few years, since before 1990.
Yeah.
And that means that there's a lot of code out there. Perl is one of these languages with a large install base, and so you find people who end up getting code inherited from somewhere else. And I'll show some of this material on the slides. That we find that legacy Perl can stink. Code that you've gotten from someone else, or even code that you wrote yourself, but some years ago when you were less wise or didn't remember what was going on.
I know how that goes.
And it may even be bad when you're the author. But why should that be? What's the reason for that? And partly this lies in the motto of Perl. Right from the front of the Perl programming book, the motto of Perl, there's more than one way to do it. It's even abbreviated TIMTOTY, a common Perl acronym. Unfortunately, that means that while Perl has this low barrier to entry, you can write, as we call it, baby Perl. You can get started writing programs very quickly with very little knowledge. We're really giving you in Perl enough rope to build a suspension bridge or to hang yourself. And you can do either one. Perl is about freedom. So people could end up using more than one way of doing things in the same program. So let's look at some of the myths about Perl and talk about those, because there's a lot of talk about things like Perl programming doesn't require the same discipline as other languages. Well, yes and no. It may require more discipline, because there are so many ways of doing things in Perl that you need to follow discipline of proper programming practices yourself.
So for instance, where it would be easier to just hack something through, and that can be done, you have to kind of rein yourself in to do it right the first time. Is that what you're saying?
Perl has given you the freedom to express yourself in many different ways, and you can use that for good or for evil.
Right.
And so the cure for that is to adopt best practices. There's even a book on it from O'Reilly, written by my good friend Damien Conway, with this adorable dog on the cover. And then there's the myth that Perl is either too slow or unpredictable to be used for serious work. Well, it may or may not be too slow, but you'd be surprised where it's actually faster than you might think, because Perl is written in C to begin with.
Right.
And so a lot of very high-level operations compile to very fast C code and performs certain string matching, for instance, operations faster than you could write your own C, because that C has been optimized over the last couple of decades.
I've never noticed Perl to be too slow.
Well, if you were writing something like a device driver or an operating system, you'd probably have trouble, but then that's we wouldn't recommend it for that.
Understood.
Is it unpredictable only when you're programming without discipline or understanding. There's no free lunch in Perl or anything else. Perl does contain lots of shortcuts, special cases, but they're there to make your life easier, not to eliminate the need for thinking. So the cure for this myth is to learn about algorithms, learn about profiling. I may talk about that later. Learn about benchmarking.
So best programming practices.
Right.
To which are good for any language, but especially for Perl when you need the discipline the most.
Yeah. So you can see how fast things really take. Benchmarking itself is an art because even the most experienced programmer, if you give them a program and say what's causing this to be slow, we usually get it wrong. So we don't. the best programmers don't guess. We go and measure. And then there's the myth that Perl is a write-only language. And this is another product of insufficient discipline. It's the dark side of there's more than one way to do it. And so again, adopt best practices and eschew or avoid obfuscation.
Define obfuscation.
Obfuscation, there's actually was a obfuscated Perl contest where we would have competition to see who could come up with code that was the most impossible to figure out and produce the most unpredictable results. Many languages have this kind of contest. There are some that pride themselves on it not being possible to write obfuscated code, although I don't know about that. I think you could do it in any language.
Well, that's an interesting game to do because by doing that, by seeing what is possible, what the worst is, then you know what to avoid. So that's good. When
you know what the worst is in one direction, then if you know what that direction is, then you can also know what the other direction is.
Exactly.
Make things better. Some people obfuscate accidentally too.
I do that a lot in PHP.
So if you find yourself presented with code that you've been asked to take over, probably the best thing you can do is go and find the author, whatever it takes, and find out, first of all, are they a better programmer than you, or worse, especially better or worse at Perl, because that helps you answer questions when you're looking at their code. The most common one you're going to have is, why did they do this way? And if you've got some obscure piece of code there and you know that they're not as good a programmer as you are, well then you know that maybe they did it that way because that was the best they could come up with. On the other hand, if they're really good, then you know that, hey, maybe I should ask them or look at this in more detail because maybe they're doing something here that's trickier than I understand for a reason.
Oh, I see.
And they just forgot to tell me. So what was their background? If they're not a native Perl programmer, if they haven't been programming it for a long time, then they're likely to program it according to the idioms of what they're most familiar with. If it's C++, then you'll see one type of code. If it's shell, you'll see another. Perl lets you write Perl in ways that look like all kinds of different languages. And, this is one of my favorite little cute demonstrations here. What was the code optimized for? Because if the programmer got around to doing any optimization, then we often make assumptions about what that was. Like we assume that it was optimized for running fast or portability or something like that. And it may not have been, well, let's have a look at that. It may not have been optimized for that at all. And you want to find out what was it optimized for and is that still a valid concern? So here's some code that performs a task. It's a little word programming type of task. It's explained by the comment, which is a good thing to put in for maintainability. It's got a labeled outer loop and it's got very understandable use of operators and functions in here and well-named variables, and takes up less than a screen, but it's still nicely indented and everything is logical and explains what it's for. Now, so that's optimized to be maintainable. This code here does exactly the same thing. If you give it the same inputs, you'll get the same outputs. Looks nothing like that. It's optimized for performance. There's a lot of repetition there, but it's that's in order for this to run fast, that loop has been unrolled, so it will run a little bit faster.
But not necessarily as readable.
Exactly.
Right.
But if you want that code to run fast, and sometimes this might be at the heart of something that's being called a lot of times, then you'd want to do that. Now here's something that's been optimized to take as few characters as possible. Maybe it has to run inside a doorknob or something with 100 bytes of memory. And it can actually be done in a few less characters than this. But this, again, does exactly the same thing with the same inputs, the same outputs.
Now, brevity, what would be the point of brevity if...
What would be the point? Well, this is
if
what...
it's not faster and it's not more readable, what's the point of brevity?
There's something called Perl golf contests, which no one gets paid for, but have an enormous amount of fun where we take a problem and see how few characters can you solve it in. Okay. Otherwise, knowing these kind of tricks, again, it's that thing about if you go in the wrong direction, if you know how far to go in the wrong direction, then it also gives you a clue how far to go in the right direction.
Because I can't read this at all.
Exactly. And this is where the reputation of Perl comes from, of unjustified reputation for this kind of programming, because people have seen this, didn't realize that it was done for fun. It can be done this way. You can do RSA decryption in 3 lines of Perl. It looks like this. But that just because you can doesn't mean you should. Right.
And I hope that I'm not the person that comes afterward to have to maintain that.
Exactly. But knowing some of these techniques can sometimes help you when you're writing a one-liner. It's not going to be saved, not going to be given to someone else, but you want to type something out real fast on the command line to do a job. And if you know these things, then you minimize your typing. It's not going to be seen by anyone else. And here's one that's optimized for job security. Okay, this does, again, exactly the same thing, but how long are you going to have to look at this to figure out what it does? It's got unexpected use of unexpected functions, and well, the less said about it, the better.
So I'm thinking here, if no one can read my code and no one can fix my code, then they can't get rid of me.
Right. I don't know how many people do that deliberately, although I'm sure there are some, but you can have this sort of thing happen by accident.
Right.
Do we have any questions at the moment?
No,
I want
not yet.
to break when there's when that's appropriate.
Right. It says this Rhonda Heath says much of this information is applicable to programming best practices in general, not just Perl, which I absolutely agree with, because I'm a LAMP programmer, and if someone's a Python programmer, I mean, you can't just go out there and learn a language. You need the foundations of design and proper practices and testing before you can go out there and do a decent job at it.
Absolutely. One of the next things you should do is testing. Create tests for the legacy code. This is really like having a tooth pulled without anesthetic, but because it's so much easier and more fun to write tests for code that you're writing yourself. But those tests will give you a baseline on which to gauge whether your changes have broken what you're working on. And one of the the basic module for doing that in Perl is test more. And here are some other modules that are useful. Normally, this is part of a much longer presentation that I'm just excerpting here, and we can go into these in more detail that we don't have time for now. And Perl has an enormous test infrastructure. Thanks to the work of people like Michael Schwerin, the number of tests performed on Perl itself to make sure it works has just mushroomed by tens of thousands to well over 100,000. So we've taken this philosophy really to heart in Perl and use it for things like test-driven development.
Absolutely. That's so important. I do have a question here. It says, Edwin says, is brevity a good indicator of good performance in general?
Meaning, will a program that's got the fewest number of characters be the fastest to run?
That's what I'm thinking. That's what the question means, and I would say no.
It wasn't in the case of that I just showed, because I did actually measure those. It can be. You might think that the fewer characters there are, the less work or less time is spent by Perl figuring out what the program means.
But the same operations have to happen.
The Perl interpreter, well, Perl works by compiling what it sees and then running this compiled internal variation. And the Perl compiler is so blindingly fast. Most Perl programs these days pull in modules and end up being effectively tens of thousands of lines long, and yet you don't notice that it does that in a fraction of a second.
Right.
So in general, brevity is not going to mean super fast.
Not necessary.
No, it might.
And especially when you're comparing it to the time you're going to take to try to maintain this code that's so short that it's not readable.
And well, that's a very good point. I'm glad you brought that up.
Right.
Is that what we should optimize for is first and foremost programmer time, because our time is far more valuable than microseconds of a computer.
Exactly.
Sometime down the road you may find out that you need to save those microseconds, but I see far too often people, especially on help groups, saying, well, use this piece of code instead because it will execute this tiny amount faster.
Right.
That you're not even likely to notice. Well,
I'm
who
not
cares
in that camp.
if a program is going to run in 0.1 second as opposed to 0.01 second if that's the only difference it makes.
Unless you're working at a supercomputing.
Unless it's something that's going to be run a million times.
Right.
And so optimize for programmer time first.
Right, okay. I hope that answered your question, Edwin. And
something people often forget is that tests are real programs too. They start writing the tests and don't indent. I am guilty of this too. Don't follow proper variable naming and don't think that the tests are going to be around maintained by anyone else, and of course none of that is true. So here are some suggestions for following good development practices with those. Make them strict and warning safe. If there's common code in tests, take those out into modules and put those in your directory where the tests are, so that the tests can stay small, because they're going to get big anyway as you add to them.
Yeah. For Matt Roberts, my senior developer, he will be the first to attest that I'm one of the biggest perpetrators of that. He has to deal with my legacy code.
Yes, and with Perl having been around, even Perl 5, 1991, we're facing, and Perl has huge install base relative to other scripting languages, and so this is a problem that is only going to grow over time. And people don't realize usually that tests can prompt for passwords and do user interaction if necessary. They think, well, I can't write a test for this because it's got to talk to the user. No, you could write tests that do that as well. Many techniques for that. You can even test web applications if there's something running behind a web server. Now, if it was well designed, it would use something like model view controller pattern, and so you could test independently of the web interface. But we're talking about legacy code, so maybe it's not. And then you can use something like recognize, which acts like a browser. Makes it very easy to navigate and fill in forms, and you can write programs like this that have tests in them.
Does that work sort of like curl?
Yes, from within Perl. And so here's a program that tests that you're able to fetch a page, that you're able to submit a username and password and log in. And that functionality has now been abstracted out into a module called test recognize, which provides the testing methods for a mechanized object itself.
Oh, that's fantastic, not having to go through any sort of web server so that you can separate out what would be a problem with the server itself with what is a problem with your actual code. That's
the ideal way to do it. And if you can't, then you use something like this, which will talk to the application on the web server. Now, as far as layout goes, I always think that code should be pretty to look at. Some languages don't leave you much of a choice in this factor, but Perl, again, it's a matter of how much rope you get. So I think that code should be beautiful. There's a book from O'Reilly called Beautiful Code. And if a language doesn't give you that capability to be beautiful on some sense, then there is no art. But if there's art, then there's a place for beauty. What's your role in modifying some code? Sorry, skipped a slide there. don't reformat code if you're just making a quick change with someone, because people get very, if it's going back to the person who wrote it, then they will be very upset by things like braces being moved where they're not used to putting them, even if you think that's the way God intended them to be. So,
and you might be making, causing unintended consequences there. There might be a reason for those braces to be there.
Exactly.
Right.
But what you can do if you're taking it over is, if you don't like the layout, or if there isn't a layout, you can use a program called perltidy. It's on the CPAN. Here's some code that is in what I call the legacy indentation format, in other words, none. And you run it through perltidy, then you get that out.
Yeah, that's much nicer.
Which is much nicer. And
much more
perltidy
readable.
can take all kinds of options. So if I use a different style, mine looks like that. I like my braces there.
That's pretty.
That starts a religious debate right there. And yet perltidy can do that too.
It almost doesn't look like Perl even.
Well, that's now you're going to start a fight.
You don't have the one line with the that's just kind of the stereotype of Perl, I would say, is the brevity, the one line that has all the different the characters in it.
Well, stereotypes come from somewhere, and I've shown where they come from in Perl, but and also that's a very small fraction of the overall picture.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cause a fight.
I wouldn't get the fight from me, but there's plenty of other people.
Sure.
Some of the other things to do are analyze a program, because maybe you need to optimize it for performance. So you can for testing you want to develop code coverage tools. We want to use code coverage tools so that you can see whether there's any parts of the code that haven't been tested. Because if they haven't been tested, then how do you know they work?
Okay. Real quick, I have a question. Sorry to interrupt there. Chris Jones asks, can you alter perltidy to your specific desires? And then there's actually an answer on here from Ruth Iverson saying, Chris, yes with .perltidyrc. Would you agree with that?
Yes, Ruth, and thanks for the question, Chris. That's you certainly can alter perltidy in every way conceivable to where standardizing on where to put or how much space to put around operators, indentation of braces, whether they're on new lines, and lining up all kinds of things. You can really use that to make programs look exactly the way you like.
Great. So you can tell perltidy, I actually like my braces to be kind of more in line, not necessarily
you can have them on lines by themselves, in line. The styles called ANSI, called KNR or BSD are two of the picks, but there is a couple of dozen options that you can use to configure different parts.
That's excellent. Oh, you're not having to conform to somebody else's idea of style.
Right. And you can even use this in a team to promote harmony and goodwill and eliminate fights, because if you've got a team with people and one person likes it formatted this way, another person likes it formatted another way, and you think, well, one of these people is going to have to lose, right? If we have to have a house style. Not necessarily true. You're going to have a common repository for the tools. If you take the code and check it in through perltidy, so that it runs through perltidy to get converted to some common house style format, but when you check it out, you run it through perltidy to convert it to yours, then you can see it the way you like.
That's great.
And everyone else can see it the way they like.
That's great. Okay.
So profiling,
thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Chris, profiling would be how you tell where is my code running fast or slow, where does it spend the most time. There's a tool that comes with Perl called DWIM that does that. It's getting a bit long in the tooth. It creates a very large output file. Far better is one that you can get off CPAN called NYTProf. And it's called that because the New York Times helped pay for its development. And this is Tim Bunce's module here. It produces terrific reports, here's a fraction of one that just shows, and I don't know how much of that is visible, but the time spent inside various subroutines ranked according to the number of calls that they made.
Wow.
And that will answer your questions about, well, where should I look to save time? If time is important, if you know you've got to save time, then profile it first. Don't take a guess.
Well, just on first glance, you can see exactly where the problems are. That's great.
You can see what's taking the most amount of time, and that tells you where to concentrate your efforts. Other things that you might want to look out for in inherited code, if you don't know the author, then take a guess at what level of expertise they had. And this is like archaeology on their code. Did they use hashes, regular expressions? If not, well, maybe they weren't comfortable with those. That tells you a lot. Do they, instead of using hierarchical data structures, or what we call lists of lists, use parallels, array, and hash structures? Tells you that they were not comfortable with references. Do they call external programs unnecessarily? These are some of the markers to look out for, and that tell you their experience level. What version of Perl was it apparently developed for? Amazing that Perl 5 came out in 1991, and yet there's still this vast amount of code out there that was written for Perl 4 that was only a few years old at the time.
Perl 5 came out when?
1991.
91, and people are still...
Now, people think, okay, well, it's been all that time. Bear in mind, we have a second digit in the version number, and we're now up to Perl 5.13.
Oh my gosh!
And so the difference between Perl 5.13 and 5.0 is massive in terms of the extra features added. It just happens to be completely backwards compatible with tiny variations.
Wow!
Really, in fact, for that matter, it's backwards compatible with Perl 4.
Really?
Yeah. Perl 6, that'll be a different matter.
That's fantastic. Now, what's on the slate for Perl 6, real quick?
Perl 6 is under development. I'm aware of all the jokes, so you don't have to make those. It's been under development for a long time. But it has really reached, is approaching a critical mass here in terms of the features that it has. There's not much left to do before this is can be considered a released language. At the moment, you should consider that it's experimental. Okay.
Still in beta form.
But you can, because certain important things haven't been done.
Okay.
But this is going to be a major, major new language.
Huge. Maybe we'll hear about it at NOSCON.
Oh, definitely.
Okay.
And then there's cargo cult Perl. Does it use idioms that people just cut and paste? I may show some of those later on. Here's what I call code symptomatic of the documentation hound, okay? And you'll find something like this is written by someone who's maybe paid by the word. And the truth is that there's really only one line of code here, and everything else is comments or superfluous stuff. And
yeah, that's a little much, maybe.
But this is, in certain large organizations, I'm not exaggerating really here, people follow boilerplate and put all this block comments before subroutines. And not that documentation is bad, but do you want it in between your code? Because then you're switching between reading code and reading documentation. It requires two different parts of your brain. Why have to jump between one and the other all of the time? So a better approach, move that documentation to pod, Perl's documentation format, somewhere later on. That's where it belongs. And then you can get it out with a documentation tool like PerlDoc. Keep anything about the function and method signatures and descriptions in line, but where possible, make the code tell the story, so that the comment, like the classic one, add 1 to I, a comment of that is just is not adding anything. You should be able to see that from the code.
Exactly.
And preserve comments that answer the question of why. Why did the programmer choose to do it this way, especially if there's a more obvious way.
Make it as self-explanatory as possible. And does that require the use of pseudocode, that sort of thing, in terms of planning?
It depends on the practices of the person who did it. Maybe they did pseudocode. A common way of developing is to program in paragraphs. And write, comment on what something's supposed to do, then write the paragraph of code that comes after that.
Got it.
You can, anything to do with the author and history information should be taken care of by revision control instead of maintaining that manually, and so forth.
Revision control meaning something like CVS?
CVS, Subversion, Git.
Subversion, yeah. Okay.
So here's, you can write any language in Perl, and so you can write. You see programs like this, and it's really someone who's not familiar with regular expressions,
sure.
Which this does the same thing, except that there's a gotcha to this, because if you've got this code, which is allegedly doing the same thing, and then you look closer and you realize, well, wait a minute, that list of numbers has the 6 missing, which you didn't spot the first time. Now you're really thrown, because, well, did they mean to omit the 6, and what does that mean? Or did they not mean to omit the 6, and what are the consequences of this code having run all these years without that?
Oh my gosh.
And so that's why shortening code like that to a regular expression like this, there's just so fewer places for a bug to hide.
Right. It just makes sense. Because here you're saying digits. Any digits.
Even something like this in later versions of Perl needs revision, because now Perl does Unicode, and so its concept of what is not a digit, which is what the \big D means, is now includes all kinds of characters that maybe you didn't think of.
Oh, I see.
So might need to be more explicit about that. And then there's just repetition. Repetition is always a key that there's something that could be done better. This I took out of code that I saw. I actually lifted this from a real program and didn't make it up, and can be condensed to that, of course.
Of course.
And yet, the person who did this thought, well, that's really nice formatting. I've got one line for each of these things. They're all lined up. Doesn't that look good? But I think this looks better.
And if you have to change any one of those,
you have to change
them all.
Right. Then there's people who just have what I call too much time on their hands to type all this stuff out. This is sending an email message from a fragment of a code using a module. And it's the same stuff on each line. Wouldn't it look a lot better?
For Christmas, I would like Perl 6.
Yes, that's one of the running jokes in the Perl 6 community. It'll be out by Christmas. We just don't know which one. And so isn't it better if you've got a string to make it look like a string and not be surrounded by this code? If you want, you can even indent it with a little bit of extra effort and using some more code up there. Or there are modules that will let you indent it, like text outdent. But avoid that repetition, like in things like this, which is ridiculous. But I see this many, many times. People print out HTML code from within a Perl program with all these print statements.
I've been guilty of that.
And it's just, you could print it out as a single section, like we did. No, never mind. Now you can find out alternatives.
Right.
Because now you have got 2 languages to parse at the same time. You've got to look at this and think Perl. At the same time, you're looking at this and thinking HTML. And there's really 2 different parts of your brain trying to read this at the same time. It introduces unnecessary cognitive dissonance.
Right.
You can instead, much better approach is to, come on, go back. Use a templating system. So if you've got HTML, take it.
Right.
So I'm getting a bit of a lag here on.
I did learn my lesson with that eventually. It was a long time ago.
If you can take your HTML and put it out into separate files, now
templates,
you can do all kinds of things with it, like the tools that work with HTML specifically.
Well, it just kind of gets to be a bad habit. You start out printing something that's just super quick and, like what you said, just for testing purposes. And because you're just thinking, oh, it'll just be quick, but then it sort of piles on itself if you don't go back and fix it.
Right.
So you might as well do it correctly the first time.
Well, Not necessarily, but the generic lesson from extreme programming is that when you find yourself repeating things, you should refactor.
Exactly.
And people often forget that in Agile programming. They get too lazy and they say, well, I'll develop the simplest thing that works, and then when I need to do something else with it, I'll add the simplest thing that works for that. But they don't look for repetition and then factor that out, which is what
so you can get code reuse and modularity and
to keep going. Exactly. Then there's the perils of cut and paste. This is carried out of a fragment of the Perl documentation for local time, and you see this in code all of the time, and yet the programmer only wants to use 2 of those things, like the month and the day. So why bother fetching out the second, the minute, the hour? It was lazy to write, but not lazy to read, because now you're looking at these variables going, well, what are they going to be used for? Part of your brain is doing that. It's like the old thing about, well, if a gun appears on the mantelpiece in Act 1 of a play, it better be fired by Act 3. Otherwise, because the audience is always going to be thinking, when is it going to happen? And if you see variable declared somewhere, part of your brain is puts that on a hook and says, when do I expect to see that appear?
It's a problem of psychology.
Right. Reading programs, understanding them is all about psychology. So a cure for that would be instead just take out the ones you want and use a list slice to get those. Or if you don't like the magic numbers there, then you can use a module to get them out by name. And then there's this kind of thing is just universal. You see Perl programs that start with this huge laundry list of variables being declared. And it's like temp1, temp2, this, all kinds of other things that they're going to refer to later on. I mean, points for using my for lexical variables, but like minus several thousand for declaring too many of them. And what you can do instead, move variable declaration to the latest possible point in the innermost scope possible. Exception to that would be configuration settings. Anything to do with the configuration, if possible, put them up in a separate file. Use inline declarations for loop variables. I know this may seem obvious to many of you, but I've seen it way too much in other code. And you can even, the word my is basically a qualifier on a variable.
Right.
You can use it anywhere that the variable appears, even after an referencing operator in a call to the getops function, which expects a reference to a hash.
Yeah. So the idea is to be able to know exactly where your variable is relevant and not slip into that bad habit of globalizing things and then running the risk of obliterating it later without realizing it.
Exactly. Yeah. Ruth, thanks for posting that URL to Mark Jason Dominus's article on scoping. Coping with scoping, that's a classic and article that never goes out of style. It's really, really worth reading.
Okay. Yes, and Jason says, don't my up variables until you need them. It's absolutely true. And scope ignorance is frequently combined with what I call monolithic madness. Just 2,500 lines of code without a subroutine in sight. Oh my gosh.
I don't know if anyone...
That makes me shudder just to think about it.
Here, right. But again, people write these enormous scripts, and they just start out at 30 lines and they just grow. And the key here... Now they say, well, of course, I know where every part of it is, but the person who wrote it, maybe that day they do. Next week might be a different story. The
organized chaos argument. It's chaotic, but I know where everything is.
Right. It's like a mess in someone's bedroom. So really this needs to be refactored because the optimal length for any block of code, subroutine or another block, is a screenful. So this is not easy. You want to look for variables that have short scopes and evaluate that area to see whether it can be turned into a subroutine. There is, if you're an Eclipse fan, there is a plugin for Eclipse called Epic that handles Perl, and there's an extract subroutine method in it. I'm not an Eclipse fan, so I can't speak to the usefulness of that. Use strict, which every program should be using, is a great way of helping break this kind of thing up. Mm-hmm. And usually when you use strict to a legacy program, a zillion things break. And to minimize that time, what you can do is put use strict to the outermost scope, and then you can put blocks, encapsulate parts of the code in naked blocks, which then have no strict in, to turn that strictness off. And you gradually migrate declarations into and out of those blocks until you can shrink them and end up with something that's completely under the control of use strict. I see a question about whether there are any other useful modules for Eclipse.
Yes,
and
I was just going to ask
I'm not a user of the Perl Eclipse module plugin, so I can't speak to that. Maybe someone else in the audience can.
Mikhail, you might send an email to info@o'reillyschool.com, because we do have Eclipse experts that can help you with that. And also I see here a comment from Renee Castle saying, refactoring takes time though, time that isn't usually accounted for in the project plan, which is answered by Stephen Jacobs saying not refactoring can add time over the life of the project.
Exactly, and it's really a matter of the how to put this, maturity level of the management in control here. Now they may be driven by external factors that they haven't even told you about, or which you have got some schedule pressure, like your project is going to go away if it's not done by this time. You have to fish or cut bait. But you may or may not have management that understands what the importance of refactoring is going to do to this code later on. Yeah. And hopefully that they will be thinking about how long will this last? How long could it last? So they may think, well, this code is going to be around for the next 2 years. And I've seen lots of code that's been around for a decade after someone thought that.
So I guess the point would be, when you're explaining the timeline to your management, just be sure as a programmer that you factor in the time that you think it'll take to refactor, so that you can make it easier for yourself down the road, and indeed better for the company down the road. You can argue that. Mm-hmm.
You can argue that. Sometimes you won't
sometimes
win with some managers,
but sometimes you do.
The better armed you are, the better.
Right.
And I have a section on showing just how much Perl can look like other languages. People who are used to other languages tend to come to Perl because there's so many ways of doing it. One of those ways can look like their favorite language. Mm-hmm. So you can have Perl code that looks like this, and realize that it actually is written by someone
I was going to say, I recognize that.
that there was more used to C, so they program it like that. And when you become more fluent in Perl and you can program idiomatic Perl, speak Perl like a native, as it were, then that code can be shortened into this in Perl using native idioms. Or you can have something like this, which some of these are more contrived than anything else, is from someone who understood Fortran and can be shortened again considerably.
There's more than one way to do it.
There's even more examples. Now this really contrived, but I had to do it because because it was there. But again, Perl code that produces something that someone who was used to COBOL could have done. And when you use native Perl functions like unpack and printf, you can produce the same result in something obviously a lot more readable. And even finally,
basic,
the classic guess a number.
I do have a question here from Chris. Any strategic advice for refactoring large but production critical code bases, and what's the first step? Testability?
Absolutely, Chris. Testability, because when you use words like large and production critical, then knowing that it works, knowing that it's producing repeatable results is absolutely essential. If you've got tests that you can run and before and after a change, and they tell you, yes, it does the same thing, and you are confident in the completeness of those tests, and what will tell you whether they're complete is code coverage analysis, then you can go many, many times faster than you would if you didn't know, if you were reduced to looking at the code and going, well, it looks right.
Right.
Okay, so enough insulting basic programmers. Cargo cult Perl. Cargo cult comes from, heck, Google it. You can see what cargo
I've
cult
never heard of
means.
that.
It was during World War II, there were islands in the Pacific that had never seen outsiders until planes came by and they had to land somewhere because they were part of the war, and they would leave behind some cargo because they needed the weight to take off, and the inhabitants of the islands would form cults around these big steel birds, metal birds that had dropped out of the sky and left them this gift of stuff, and this has turned into a catchphrase. And cargo cult Perl means cutting and pasting code that you saw from someone else without knowing what it does or why you have it. One of the things you see is this code is like plastered all over the internet as something that belongs in programs that operate on web forms, and it is so much easier to say use the CGI module.
Gotcha.
Which operates instead of that and gets it right, whereas the previous code omits things that
So like for instance, making sure that an email address is formatted properly in a form.
That was we didn't even get that far with that code. That was just the code for parsing out the arguments that were passed to a form. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
It's harder than it looks. And the code I showed was generous. A lot of people use an even shorter version of it that's even more wrong. I see we have a question from RR that
is Perl 6 backwards compatible? Will Perl 6 be backwards compatible?
The short answer to that is no. It's time to break backwards compatibility for the sake of a lot of reasons, and so it will look like Perl. It does look like Perl. It's got $signs, @signs, and percents, and other things that you'll be familiar with. In fact, a lot of Perl 5 programs will run in Perl 6, but no one's going to claim that it's backwards compatible.
It's going to be an interesting transition.
It will be familiar.
Yeah.
And we're not expecting that people will want to migrate every Perl 5 program to Perl 6 and complain that it's not compatible. That's not the goal. This is really to produce and set forth a new language.
Well, you have to progress. You have to evolve.
And when you find something in the code that you don't like, at least comment it to begin with, so that you've got a standard thing you can search for to see where are things that you don't like, that just seem wrong, that you can come back to, like so-called wannabe objects and data clumps. I didn't invent these terms; they came out of this book, and it's common to see clumps of data, small or even large data structures or lists of variables being passed around a program that is crying out to be object-oriented. It's just the person was too lazy to get to the point of creating that. And yet you can create an object class inside a Perl program and make a very lightweight one. So they just assumed that you had to make a module and it had to have extra files and a lot of heavyweight stuff. Mixed abstraction levels and time dependencies are things that are higher level object-oriented concepts. Mixed abstraction levels means that you have a method where there's simple low-level code going on in between calls to higher level functions, and that sort of makes your brain jump around a abstraction hierarchy that should be all happening at the same level.
Within the same scope, yes.
And time dependencies mean that you require methods to be called in a certain order, and that's taking some of the logic out of where it belongs in the code and forcing it into the programmer's mind.
Okay.
It should be, and that's harder to restructure, to fix, but that's one of those things that should at least be commented so you understand that. I noticed we're getting close on time here, and I brought a lot more slides than we needed, so to be prepared. But
well, what we can do is we can make the slides available to the participants
absolutely.
in case they want to go through the rest of them. Mm-hmm.
And I'll just run through so you can see what those are. But line editing, one of the most important things is about reducing stuff so you can see a conceptual block at one go. So it doesn't take up more than one line width, doesn't take up more than one screen length.
Okay. I see a question here. Can we follow Peter on Twitter?
You can follow me.
I was just poking you about that
follow
last
you,
night.
follow you on Twitter.
You know, so Peter's Twitter account is Peter J. Scott.
Peter J. Scott.
Peter J. Scott, and O'Reilly School's Twitter account is O'Reilly School. So we're together there, and you can follow one or both, and you'll get all the information on Peter that you need.
I recommend, thank you, following the O'Reilly School if we can get that tag up there as well. They have a lot more to say than I do.
Oh, I think you have plenty to say. Just got to get on there.
So I've been talking a lot here. Should we see if there's any more questions?
Can we add that to the chat? Any more questions about what we've talked about so far?
I'll show these slides while we're doing that, and you can let me know if you have any questions, Trish. I
have learned a lot here today, and I know that I've definitely been guilty of a lot of these bad habits. I'm reformed over the years. After a while, you realize if you're not taught through wonderful resources like you and like courses and things like that, you end up learning the hard way, which takes a lot longer and is a lot more painful. So I'm glad that we have experts like you that can impart this knowledge before this happens to you. And hopefully you learn this and take it in and incorporate it into your day-to-day programming. And I really think it'll make your life easier in the long run. Here's a question from Chris. Any thoughts on raw Perl 5 objects versus object-oriented models, for example, Moose?
What I find is that if I'm developing something that's short enough that there's only going to be one object class in it, and I've been writing a few of those scripts lately, I'll put the object class inside the module, the script itself, and I'll just do the quick and dirty one-line new function, one-line accessor function if it's only got a few attributes. If it gets any more complicated than that, and there's more than one object class, more complex accessors, I want to validate parameters or something like that, then I would definitely split out into a separate module files, and that's where Moose would come in. Okay, and we have a question, where will the slides be? I actually need to ask Catherine that question. We can post them on o'reillyschool.com, and they'll also be on o'reilly.com, is that correct? Okay, yes, so they'll be both on o'reillyschool.com and o'reilly.com as soon as we can get them up, so stay tuned. I believe on the Webcasts page, correct? So, yeah, okay. See a couple of other questions here. David, with really ugly code, what is the first step of refactoring? If it's really ugly, then probably it's ugly in layout. So the first step in refactoring, find the author, because they might be getting a pink slip on their way out the door, so you might need to catch them really quick. Then I would check it into code repository if it's not already there, and then I would run it through perltidy. Okay, and Robert says, have you found Perl Critic useful? Yes, I have. One of the things I do is code review of legacy code for companies, and I'll run their legacy code through Perl Critic with various levels set to find problems in it and generate reports. Okay, and we have, is Moose slow? And what is Moose? Moose is an object-oriented helper module that lets you create lightweight object classes and compose in roles and traits and so forth. And any code that you add is going to slow things down, but not to the extent usually that you're going to worry about it. If you're worried about time, then you either shouldn't be programming object-oriented Perl or shouldn't be programming Perl to solve a problem, because the actual overhead that the object-oriented part of Moose adds is small compared to everything else.
Okay. Okay, and we have from Edwin, is there a future in Perl? It seems that Perl is only relegated to maintaining legacy code. I think Peter has something to say on that.
Well, maybe, Edwin, you're going off what you're seeing here because this talk is about legacy code, but there is a large future in Perl, and if you look for statistics on the installed base of Perl versus other languages, you'll see that Perl is way ahead of most of the other dynamic languages. Mm-hmm. It's a question that comes up a lot, and it's that there's no small amount of debate in the Perl community about this perception, because you find, for instance, right now, it's hard for companies to hire Perl programmers, mm-hmm. and mm-hmm. there's more demand than supply, mm-hmm. partly because of this perception that there are more exciting languages to learn, more relevant mm-hmm. languages to learn, and so companies that have Perl are actually having a hard time finding mm-hmm. Perl programmers. And
I'd like to add to that before we start any sort of course development in a certain language or technology, we do a complete market research on what kind of jobs are out there for this particular technology, because we want our students to be able to be ready to go out there in the job market in IT. And what we found with Perl, you know, it's not the fastest growing language by any means, because it's been around a long, long time. You know, it's not the hot thing, but by far, it's got the most jobs out there. Almost every company in the world uses Perl in some way, shape, or form, unless they're just completely purists on the Windows side or something like that. So we did not go into finding Peter and writing these courses lightly. Mm.
Perl doesn't have some of the marketing departments that certain other languages right. have. That's just one of its that's its biggest shortcoming, perhaps. Jason, thanks for the comment about Modulicious. There's also new frameworks like Dancer, for instance. And
we have a question from Yvonne. Any quick thoughts on differences in PHP? And I'm interested in this too, because I'm a PHP programmer.
Right, so I'm definitely not going to knock PHP. And,
you can. It's okay.
My expertise is in Perl, so I would be the old saw is better to keep your mouth shut and be taken for a fool than open it and remove all doubt. So I think that's where I'm going to.
What I would say, I'm not sure. I'm not super familiar with Perl. I've used it some. What we tend to tell prospective students when they're wondering about the differences is that PHP is almost exclusively for web development, for front end, because it embeds HTML. It's I would say it's slower probably. It's more. It's just more suited for that sort of thing. So it really depends on how you want to use it. Now, and then, something in terms of Java is great for back-end development for that sort of thing. Perl is kind of good for everything. System administrators use it, web programmers use it, back-end enterprise developers use it. So it's just kind of if you learn that, then you can do just about anything. That's what we tell people.
Exactly. There are Wall Street companies, some of the ones still alive anyway, mm-hmm. that move billions of dollars a day in transactions through Perl.
Exactly. So it better be good legacy Perl, right? Okay. It appears that we're finished with all the questions. And I want to thank everybody for coming out today and for talking with us about legacy Perl, and I feel like we got some great questions, some great interaction there, so I really appreciate that. And I want to remind you that we're going to send you all an email with a link to the recording of this webcast and to the slides, to Peter's slides, in case you want to delve further into what he was talking about. And be sure to come to OSCON, because you know that Peter will come there and be presenting and even debating with Steve Holden about Python.
We didn't get that in this time, but we will at OSCON.
Yeah. And I believe Catherine says that we're putting the slides on the O'Reilly Media SlideShare account, and it'll also all be up on o'reillyschool.com. So thanks again, and be sure to tune in later this afternoon at 1 p.m. Pacific time for our webcast with Steve Holden regarding Python Release 2 versus Release 3. All right, thanks again, and have a great day.
Thanks, Trish.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.